Thank you. And if I can now proceed with the rest of the program, which I'm afraid once more has to be principally about the situation in and around Ukraine. Now, at the moment in the West, most of the headlines continue to be dominated by the massacre or alleged massacre which has taken place or supposedly taken place in the area of Bucha, which is for all practical purposes a suburb of Ukraine's sprawling capital, Kiev. By the way, there was an interesting article in the New York Times recently, which gave an impression of the sheer vastness of the Kiev metropolitan area, which it seems is actually very large. But anyway, putting that entirely to one side, I've already discussed this issue in my previous program. I've said that I'm not going to start making assumptions about who and what actually happened at Bucha. There have been some extremely serious allegations made. The Russians have now formally denied those allegations. They're calling for an independent inquiry. They sought a meeting of the UN Security Council, which interestingly and rather curiously was blocked by the British chair. I'm not quite sure why, by the way. But anyway, I have to say straight away that I'm very sceptical that there will be any kind of independent inquiry of this incident. The more I hear about it, the more convinced I am that such an inquiry is needed, and certainly no action should be taken in response to this incident until or unless such an inquiry takes place and comes up with findings. In saying that, of course, I have no expectation that that logical course will be followed. On the contrary, all the facts point to Western governments, or some Western governments at least, now pushing for further sanctions. The French government is calling for sanctions against Russian oil and coal exports to Europe. Well, we'll see what that happens over the next few days. There's supposed to be an EU Council meeting coming up on Wednesday, and we will see what takes place there. What I will say about this is this. It seems to me increasingly obvious that there is an increasing divergence between the obsession that the political class in the West, and of course especially in Europe, has with the situation in Ukraine, and their furious practice of sanctioning Russia to the point where one would have thought sanctions would be exhausted, and the actual feelings and sentiments of people on the ground. Across Europe, and indeed the West, there is a darkening economic picture. I've already discussed many times how energy prices in Britain have surged this month. Food prices are apparently also now due to increase. I'm hearing that there's been major increases in food prices in Germany as well. There were reports, which I'm sure are true. I'm not going to say how significant this event was, but there's been reports that Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, was booed and heckled when he was on a tour of Essen, a city in, I believe, West Germany recently. And perhaps much more importantly, we've now had some election results in Hungary. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, won a sweeping victory in the elections. Apparently, I'm still some way from getting the final results of the report of the elections as I'm making this video, but apparently he has actually increased his majority, which was already a supermajority of more than 2/3 of the seats in the Hungarian parliament. And this apparently all happened on a very high turnout. I can't help but think that the reason that has happened is because he has been extremely careful to keep Hungary out of this conflict. He's insisted on keeping energy imports from Russia, continuing to run, and he's refusing, as far as I can see, to join in the enthusiastic bandwagon for sanctions, even if he has not actually so far blocked any of the sanctions that the European Union has proposed, something which I suspect would be extremely difficult for him to do, given the risk Hungary runs that if it were to take such a step, it might be deprived of its voting rights on the European Council. But anyway, that seems to be a reflection. That vote, it seems to me, in Hungary is a reflection, it seems to me, of popular attitudes, certainly in Hungary, and I suspect in much of Europe, to the sanctions war, the economic war of attrition that is being waged at the moment and which is taking such an extraordinarily heavy toll of living standards. And there's also been an election in Serbia where the Serbian leader Vučić has also won a convincing victory. And I can't help but think that this is also partly because of the balanced approach he and Serbia have taken to this crisis. By contrast, in the United States, President Biden's support is tumbling, and in France, the polls suggest that the race between Macron and Le Pen, which looked like Macron's in which it looked only a few weeks ago as if Macron was certain to move to a sweeping victory, that the polls there are now tightening. I still, by the way, expect Macron to win for all kinds of structural reasons. I still think it'd be extraordinarily difficult for Marine Le Pen to win in the second round in a French presidential election. But the fact that Macron's lead is diminishing points, in my opinion, to sentiments, the groundswell of sentiments amongst the French public as they see their living standards tumble and come under severe pressure as a result of this economic war. So we see the elites in Europe, which of course includes the media elite, as has been pointed out many times by many people. The political class in the West includes not just politicians, but the media elite as well. They're all intimately interconnected with each other. The political class is obsessed with the war in Ukraine. The population of Europe, and I suspect of the United States also, either not so much or perhaps much more concerned about the collapse of their living standards, which is intensifying. All of this, by the way, comes in contrast to the situation in Russia, where, by contrast, the polling figures suggest that support for President Putin is rising, and where the Levada polling agency now put his poll numbers at 83%. And Levada is a polling agency which until fairly recently has been perceived as critical of President Putin and of his government. So there we go. So we'll see what happens. We'll see if there's more sanctions unveiled on Wednesday. We'll see what stance Hungary takes. We'll see what stance Germany takes. We'll see where this goes. But in the meantime, as I've said previously, what happened in Bucha requires investigation. I don't think we're going to get it. And the British, inexplicably, to my mind, blocked a meeting of the Security Council, which the Russians had called, and at which the situation in Bucha was supposed to have been discussed. Now, turning to other matters, I've been receiving more reports now about the situation on the ground in Ukraine. It seems that the Russians, perhaps in retaliation to the missile strike on their oil refinery in Belgorod, launched 2 missile strikes on Ukrainian oil refineries in Kremenchuk and Odessa. And apparently these oil refineries in Ukraine account for most of Ukraine's refining of petrol to some extent, but especially of diesel oil. And as has been pointed out by a number of people, it is diesel that military vehicles need in order to move. Well, I also understand that the Ukrainian military, to the extent that it's able to move around Ukraine at all, is increasingly forced to use civilian vehicles because the toll on its armoured vehicles has been so enormous. I discussed this in yesterday's video. I'm not going to say more about it. Anyway, on the actual situation, there's not very much more information, but I do understand that the Chechen leadership, Ramzan Kadyrov and people like him, have been publishing videos that the Chechen forces, which are part of the Russian forces in Mariupol, are now engaging in the staged storming of the Azovstal steel factory, which is the main base of the Ukrainian forces in the city of Mariupol. Allegedly, 90% of the city, of the rest of the city, is now under the control of the Russians and their allies. There's still some Ukrainian forces holding out in the port area. It looks as if they've been pushed basically out of the city into the industrial facilities. Now, that all suggests that Mariupol is very close to falling. By the way, there is a report that the Russians today have opened a further humanitarian corridor out of Mariupol. Well, we'll see whether that works or not. But it does seem to me as if the final curtain is now coming down on Ukrainian resistance in that city. I would point out that the fight in Mariupol shows that the Russian high command has been wise not to get its forces bogged down in street battles trying to capture Ukrainian cities. There's massive uncertainty as to the exact number of Ukrainian troops who were bottled up in Mariupol. The highest number I've seen right at the start of the siege of Mariupol was 14,500. About a week ago, the Russians were saying that this number had fallen to 7,000. About a couple of days ago, that number had fallen further to 4,000. And I understand that the number now is even less than that. Now, I don't know whether all the other numbers, the earlier numbers, were exaggerations, or whether that's a reflection of the number of casualties that the Ukrainians have suffered in Mariupol. If it is the second, then this is a devastating blow, I would have thought, to the Ukrainian forces. It must be the biggest defeat by far and the biggest example of manpower losses in any of the battles in Ukraine so far. But again, I stress this is speculation. I can't weigh in with any precision on the numbers. Those who know or think they know more about such things are free, obviously, to speculate at their leisure in programs in the thread to this video. Going further, it does increasingly look as if the fighting elsewhere in Donbass is a case now of the Russians steadily tightening their grip on the Ukrainian forces there. Now, I've seen some maps. Again, I can't ever vouch for their total accuracy, but they seem to show Russian troops now moving well south of the town of ETHEREUM that they captured some time ago, moving steadily towards the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation, where it seems the Ukrainian forces may be concentrating in order to make what perhaps could be called their last stand. Though again, I want to stress this is simply a speculation on my part. Myself being not a military person, I can't comment on what exactly is going on there. But certainly it does look as if the noose, if you like, is tightening on the Ukrainian forces in Donbass. By the way, I've received very divergent accounts about how quickly the Battle of the Donbass is expected to go. Some say that because of the heavily fortified positions that the Ukrainians have built up in parts of Donbass, this could be a protracted battle. Others say that with supplies cut off and with some of these fortifications now outflanked, the collapse is likely to be faster. Well, as I'm not a military person, I'm not going to speculate one way or the other. We shall just have to wait and see. Meanwhile, the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia continue. The Ukrainians yesterday were making all kinds of claims that the Russians had retracted most of their demands and had accepted Ukrainian proposals almost in their totality. The Russians very quickly came out and said that this was simply untrue and that the Russian demands remained as they were. Apparently there have been more negotiations in a virtual format on Friday, and there's more such negotiations going on today. Ukraine, as the Russians have pointed out, has now accepted that it cannot join NATO and has accepted that it must have neutral status. It's also accepted major restrictions on the size of its armed forces, and it's also accepted that foreign troops cannot be based in Ukraine or engage in military exercises there without Russia's agreement. And these are significant concessions. But it seems that on other topics, on other issues, there's so far not been much movement at all. And by the way, the Russians have made clear that they are profoundly skeptical of this notion that Ukraine can join the EU if it does not join NATO. And it seems that there's not been any Russian comment about this one way or the other. I'm going to finish by saying that, in my opinion, this is probably Ukraine's last chance to come to a final agreement with the Russians. If the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, is finally and comprehensively destroyed, and by all accounts, that is the best army Ukraine has, and with Ukraine suffering increasing shortages of equipment, it's now apparently very short of tanks and armoured vehicles and probably fuel in order to operate those it has. If Ukraine doesn't come to an agreement soon, then once that Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine, in Donbass, is destroyed, then I suspect the Russians will probably toughen their terms if they are prepared to negotiate with Ukraine at all. So I would urge Ukraine to come to terms quickly. But that, of course, remains to be seen, whether they will or whether they won't. It seems that the British, for one, are advising them against doing so. Anyway, that's, it seems to me, where we stand this morning. A darkening economic picture, not just in Europe and the United States, but of course pretty much around the world. Increasing political problems for the European political class, those ones that they seem to be absolutely blind to. They don't seem to be taking note of them. And a military situation in Ukraine itself, which is deteriorating for Ukraine as its forces in Donbass face imminent attack by a much superior Russian army and probable eventual defeat and perhaps even destruction, and with the Battle of Mariupol, by far, as I said, the costliest battle in terms of loss, in terms of casualties suffered, that has been fought so far in this war, with that battle apparently now very much in its final stages. Well, that's where things appear to me to be. We'll see whether or not I'm right. And that's me for today. I look forward